Lately, it feels like, well, everyone's talking about these blockbuster medications, Ozempic, Wegovy, Manjaro.
Oh, absolutely. The buzz is incredible.
Right. The talk around them for weight loss and diabetes control is just huge. It's estimated, maybe 12% of adults in the U.S. have tried one this year alone in 2024.
That's a massive number. Really shows the impact.
And get this, the story of where they actually came from involves something truly unexpected. Lizard venom.
It sounds almost like science fiction, doesn't it? But it's amazing how something that sounds so, far-fetched can lead to such a significant medical breakthrough.
Totally.
And you're right. For you, our listener, this deep dive is all about getting the real story. Whether you're personally curious about the science, maybe know someone using these drugs, or just want to understand what everyone's talking about.
Yeah, cut through the hype.
Exactly. We're going to explore the history, the research, and how they're impacting us today.
Exactly. Our mission today is really to give you a clear and hopefully easy to understand overview. We're going to look at the origins of GLP-1, how these major drugs were developed, how they actually work their magic in the body.
The science bit.
Right, the science bit.
Yeah.
And what the clinical trials tell us, the safety aspects, and even the policy discussions that are bubbling up now.
It covers a lot of ground.
It does. And just so you know, this is actually our third deep dive into health hacks here on the channel.
Yeah.
We really enjoy, breaking down these complex health topics.
Okay, so let's go right back to the beginning then. The discovery of GLP-1 itself. What's fascinating here is this concept of incretin hormone.
Incretins, right.
Yeah. These are basically signals produced by your gut, and they play a really key role in telling your pancreas to release insulin after you eat a meal.
Okay, so it's like a communication system.
Precisely. Think of it. Your gut isn't just digesting food. It's actively signaling to your pancreas to help control blood sugar. That insight was, crucial. It paved the way for these drugs.
Okay, let's unpack this. So even before these specific medications, scientists knew there was something special happening in our bodies when we ate that helped manage blood sugar. And in the 1970s, a researcher over in Denmark, Jens Juul Holst, he made a really important observation. He saw the gut was producing something he called enteroglucagon, right?
That's right.
And this hinted at a new hormone being involved in this whole process.
Exactly, a piece of the puzzle. And around the same time, over here in the U.S. at Mass General, Joel Hebner was doing some pretty groundbreaking work cloning the gene for glucagon.
Oh,
But interestingly, he kind of unexpectedly discovered that the same gene also held the code for two other peptides.
the hidden message.
Sort of. They eventually named them GLP-1 and GLP-2. And these drugs we're talking about, they are peptides, by the way, basically just small chains of amino acids.
Right, the building blocks.
Building blocks of proteins, yeah. It was like finding something extra hidden inside something you thought you understood.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. Because then, in the mid-1980s, you have Daniel Drucker, who was a young researcher working with Hebner and Holst.
The key players.
They really started to figure out what this GLP-1 actually did. They found out that when we eat, special cells in our intestines release GLP-1 into the bloodstream. And this GLP-1 then does a whole bunch of amazing things. It tells the pancreas to release insulin.
But crucially, only when blood sugar is high.
Right, glucose dependent. And it suppresses another hormone, glucagon, and it even slows down how quickly food leaves our stomach.
Exactly. So connecting this to the bigger picture, GLP-1 is basically the body's way of saying, okay, food's arrived, let's get those blood sugar levels under control.
Makes sense.
But what was particularly significant, especially looking back now, was the finding that GLP-1 also acted on the brain. It promotes satiety, that feeling of fullness.
The appetite connection.
This was the crucial link. It connected GLP-1 not just to blood sugar regulation, but also potentially to the regulation of our body weight.
So not just diabetes, but weight too, right, from the early days. And then early 90s, Svetlana Mosov and others took it further.
Yes, they did. They identified the most active form of GLP-1, the one that really did the heavy lifting and figured out how to synthesize it in the lab.
Which is a huge step towards making a drug.
It's a massive step.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And if we look at the impact of this early research, fast forward to 2024, these pioneering scientists, Hebner, Holst, Drucker, Mosov, and others, they've received some of the most prestigious awards in medicine.
Deservedly so.
It really just underscores the fundamental importance of what they discovered back then.
But as you hinted at earlier, there was a bit of a snag, right? This natural GLP-1, it wasn't exactly ready for prime time as a drug.
That's a key point, yeah. Interestingly, native GLP-1 has a very, very short half-life in the body. We're talking like a couple of
Just
minutes.
2 minutes. Wow.
Yeah, it gets broken down incredibly quickly by an enzyme called DPP4. So this made it really difficult to envision using it directly as a medication. It just wouldn't stick around long enough to have a meaningful therapeutic effect.
Okay, so that's the problem.
Yeah.
Big problem. How did we go from this hormone that disappears in minutes to these drugs people are taking, once a week? This is where our unlikely hero comes in, right? The lizard.
You got it, the Gila monster. This leads us to a really pivotal and, frankly, quite amazing development. In 1992, a researcher named Dr. John Eng, working at a VA medical center,
Okay.
he was studying the venom of the Gila monster, and he found a peptide in its saliva that he named Exendin-4.
Lizard saliva. So what was the magic? What made the lizard peptide so special compared to ours?
Well, Exendin-4 turned out to be remarkably similar to human GLP-1 in its effects, particularly on insulin secretion. However, and this was the absolute crucial difference, it was resistant to that rapid breakdown by the DPP-4 enzyme.
So it hung around longer.
Much longer in the bloodstream. It had the good effects without that major drawback of the short lifespan.
That must have been a real aha moment for Dr. Eng. Like, wait a minute.
Oh, absolutely. A huge light bulb moment. He immediately recognized the potential of this lizard peptide as the foundation for a new type of drug. He isolated it, characterized it thoroughly, and then licensed it to a small biotech company called Amylin Pharmaceuticals.
For development.
Right, to develop it into a human therapy.
And that led directly to the first GLP-1 receptor agonist drug hitting the market.
Exactly. That work culminated in 2005 when the FDA in the U.S. approved exenatide, the synthetic version of that lizard peptide, Exendin-4, under the brand name Byetta.
Byetta. Okay, I remember that name.
Yeah, it was a huge milestone. Byetta was an injectable medication taken twice a day, initially for people with type 2 diabetes. It helped lower their blood sugar, and importantly, it also led to some modest weight reduction as a side effect.
So even the first one had that weight effect.
It did. And for many patients, it could even delay the need for starting insulin injections, which was a big deal. And you mentioned peptides needing injection because they'd just be digested like food in the stomach. They need to go under the skin, subcutaneous, to get into the bloodstream.
Right. Makes sense. And they even developed a longer-acting version later on, didn't they?
They did, yeah. A few years later, a once-weekly injectable formulation called Bydureon was also developed, making it a bit more convenient.
Still, twice daily or even weekly from a lizard.
It's incredible. And what's really impactful here is to think that within its first 15 years or so, over 2 million patients worldwide used exenatide in some form.
2 million.
All thanks, ultimately, to a discovery in the venom of a Gila monster. It's just a truly remarkable example of where scientific breakthroughs can sometimes come from. Serendipity.
Okay, so Byetta was the first one out of the gate based on the lizard venom. But it sounds like the story definitely doesn't end there. There was a race, kind of, to make even better drugs.
Oh, absolutely.
Ones that lasted longer, maybe worked better, and could specifically target obesity, not just be a side effect for diabetes.
Precisely. Following the success and the proof of concept from exenatide, there was a real push in the pharmaceutical industry to improve upon it. The key goals were, as you said, developing drugs with longer-lasting action, meaning fewer injections for patients, which is always a plus, and also really exploring their potential for treating obesity as a primary goal.
And Novo Nordisk, the Danish company, they really stepped into a leading role here, right? I guess building on that early GLP-1 research connection with Holst.
They did. They had a strong background. And in the 1990s, a scientist at Novo Nordisk named Lotte Geir Knudsen and her team, they engineered a modified version of human GLP-1. This one was called liraglutide.
Liraglutide.
So it's very similar to the GLP-1 your own body makes, that's the analog part, but with a clever tweak to make it work better as a medicine.
What was the tweak?
Interestingly, they attached a fatty acid molecule, like a little tail, to the GLP-1 molecule. This allows it to bind onto albumin, which is a very common protein circulating in your blood. Think of albumin as like a taxi service.
Carrying it around.
Exactly, carrying the drug around, but also protecting it from being broken down too quickly by that DPP4 enzyme. This clever modification made it much more resistant to degradation in the body.
So lasted longer.
Much longer, resulting in a drug that only needed to be injected once a day.
So a step up in convenience from Byetta's twice daily.
Yeah.
And this liraglutide, that became Victoza.
That's correct. Victoza was approved in the U.S. in 2010 specifically for treating type 2 diabetes. It offered that more convenient once-daily dosing, and generally, studies showed slightly better efficacy in lowering blood sugar compared to exenatide at the time.
Okay, but here's the key thing, right? The weight loss.
Exactly. Here's the crucial point. During the clinical trials for Victoza, the researchers consistently observed that patients were losing weight. Not just a little bit, but around 5 to 7% of their body weight on average.
Which is noticeable.
Definitely noticeable. And this observation sparked Novo Nordisk to specifically investigate its potential not just for diabetes, but for obesity itself.
And that led to another approval, specifically for weight loss this time.
It did. In 2014, a higher dose of that same molecule, liraglutide, was approved under the brand name Saxenda, and this was for chronic weight management.
Saxenda.
This was a really significant milestone because it was the very first GLP-1 drug approved for treating obesity in individuals who didn't necessarily have type 2 diabetes.
Wow. So liraglutide really opened the door to treating obesity directly with this class of drugs. That's a big shift. And then it seems like a whole bunch of other GLP-1 analogs started popping up in the 2010s, each with their own little twist.
Yes, it was definitely a period of intense innovation and competition in the field. We saw the development of that exenatide extended release by Durion, the once-weekly version.
Right.
Then there was lixacenidide brand names Lixumia or Adlixin, which was actually a shorter-acting analog, given once daily. Eli Lilly entered the fray with dulaglutide, marketed as Trulicity.
Trulicity, yeah, I've heard of that one.
That was a once-weekly GLP-1 that was cleverly fused to part of an antibody molecule, which is a way to make it last much longer in the body. And there was also another one called albiglutide, Tanzium, another weekly option, although it didn't seem to have quite as strong a weight loss effect compared to others and was eventually withdrawn from the market.
Okay, so lots of different approaches trying to get that longer action and good efficacy, but then came semaglutide, which really seems to be the one that, well, changed the game again. Massively.
Absolutely. Semaglutide, also developed by Novo Nordisk, truly represented a significant leap forward. It's a very potent GLP-1 analog structure-wise. It's about 94% similar to our own human GLP-1.
Very close.
Very close. But with some key modifications, again, designed to make it last much longer, allowing for just once-a-week injection. It was first approved in 2017 for type 2 diabetes under the name Ozempic.
Ozempic, the name everyone knows now.
Pretty much. And it showed really impressive glucose control in trials with quite significant reductions in HbA1c levels, that key marker of long-term blood sugar.
What kind of reductions are we talking?
Often in the range of 1.5 to 1.8% reductions in HbA1c, which is substantial. And alongside that, notable weight loss was seen even in the diabetes patients, around 5 to 10 kilograms, or roughly 11 to 22 pounds on average.
And then they even cracked the code for a pill version.
That's Rybelsus, right?
Yes, that was another major step. In 2019, oral semaglutide, Rybelsus, got approved. This was a huge achievement because, as we've discussed, these peptide drugs usually need injection to bypass digestion.
Right. How did they manage it?
Rybelsus uses a special molecule, an absorption enhancer, that basically helps shuttle semaglutide across the lining of the stomach into the bloodstream before it gets destroyed. It was the first GLP-1 drug that could be taken as a pill.
Incredible. But the real, cultural phenomenon has been the high-dose version of semaglutide for obesity, Wegovy. That's right, Wegovy. It contains a higher dose of semaglutide, 2.4 milligrams weekly, compared to the typical Ozempic doses for diabetes. It was approved in the U.S. in 2021 specifically for the treatment of obesity.
And the results were, well, pretty staggering.
Truly unprecedented for a weight loss medication. The clinical trial program, called STEP, showed that over 68 weeks, people with obesity lost, on average, around 15% of their body weight.
15%. Compared to what? Placebo.
Compared to just 2 to 3% loss in the placebo group, the difference was massive. And this level of weight loss wasn't just incremental. It started approaching levels previously only really seen with bariatric surgery.
That is a paradigm shift.
It really was. These results were so significant that Wegovy instantly became a game changer in how doctors and the public thought about treating obesity.
15% is potentially life-changing weight loss for many people, getting close to surgical results without surgery. And now, hot on its heels, we have tirzepatide, the latest big player on the scene.
Tirzepatide, yes. Developed by Eli Lilly, it's indeed the latest major entrant, and it's generating a lot of excitement for a good reason. It's what's called a dual agonist.
Dual agonist, what does that mean?
It means it activates not just the GLP-1 receptor, like the drugs we've been discussing, but also another important incretin hormone receptor called GIP, or glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide.
So hitting two targets instead of one.
Exactly. And this dual action seems to lead to even greater effects synergistically on both blood sugar control and on weight loss.
How much better? Are there direct comparisons?
Yes, there have been head-to-head clinical trials comparing tirzepatide directly against semaglutide. And these trials showed that tirzepatide resulted in significantly greater reductions in HbA1c and more body weight loss compared to the highest approved dose of semaglutide for diabetes.
So it really looks like a step up again in terms of sheer effectiveness.
The data strongly indicates that yes, tirzepatide was first approved for type 2 diabetes in 2022 under the brand name Mounjaro.
Mounjaro. Got it.
And then, following really impressive results from its obesity trial program called SURMOUNT, it received FDA approval specifically for chronic weight management in late 2023 in the U.S. under the brand name Zepbound.
Zepbound. So Mounjaro for diabetes, Zepbound for obesity, but the same drug inside.
Correct. Different names, different dosing, perhaps for different indications. And the weight loss seen in those SURMOUNT trials has been truly astonishing. We're talking average weight loss of up to 21, maybe even 22% on the highest dose over about 72 weeks.
21%. That's deep into bariatric surgery territory.
It absolutely is. With nearly half the people on the highest dose in one key trial losing at least 20% of their body weight, this really positions tirzepatide as perhaps the leading edge of the next generation of these incretin-based therapies. And there are even other combination agonists targeting maybe 3 pathways already in development behind it.
Wow. It's just incredible how far this field has rocketed forward in, what, less than 20 years since Beata?
It's been remarkably fast-paced, especially the last 5-10 years.
And these droids aren't just a U.S. phenomenon, are they? They're being rolled out and used all around the world now.
Absolutely. These GLP-1 drugs have seen global adoption. Europe has generally followed the U.S. with approvals for both diabetes and obesity indications. Even countries like Japan, which historically had been very cautious and hadn't approved a new obesity medication in decades, approved semaglutide, Wegovy, in 2023, although they often have quite strict criteria for who qualifies.
Interesting. And China.
China is another major market. They've now approved both semaglutide as Wegovy and tirzepatide for long-term weight management just recently in 2024. And there are even local Chinese companies developing their own versions. This widespread regulatory acceptance really highlights the global recognition of the significant benefits these therapies offer for major public health issues like diabetes and obesity.
Okay, so we know these drugs mimic our natural GLP-1 hormone, and tirzepatide hits GIP too. But can you break down a bit more exactly how they work in our bodies? What are the key mechanisms behind these impressive effects we're seeing?
Certainly. So as the name suggests, GLP-1 receptor agonists work by binding to and activating the GLP-1 receptors found on various cells in our body, essentially mimicking or boosting the action of our natural GLP-1. One of the primary actions, especially relevant for diabetes, is enhancing glucose-dependent insulin secretion from the pancreas.
The smart insulin release you mentioned.
Exactly. The drug tells the pancreas beta cells to release more insulin, but importantly, it only does this when blood sugar levels are elevated, typically after a meal. This is why they have a much lower risk of causing hypoglycemia or dangerously low blood sugar compared to older drugs like sulfonylureas or insulin itself.
That's a major safety advantage. What else?
They also suppress the release of glucagon. Glucagon is another pancreatic hormone that normally acts to raise blood sugar levels, mainly by telling the liver to release stored glucose. So by suppressing glucagon, especially after meals when it's not needed, they help keep post-meal blood sugar spikes in check.
Okay, so boost insulin when needed, cut back glucagon. What about the stomach effects?
Right. They also slow down gastric emptying. This means that food stays in your stomach for a longer period before moving into the small intestine. This contributes to feeling fuller sooner during a meal and staying full for longer afterwards.
The satiety effect.
Part of it, yes. And crucially, they also act directly on appetite centers in the brain, specifically in areas like the hypothalamus. They basically signal to the brain to reduce appetite and increase feelings of satiety or fullness.
So it's a multi-pronged attack, really. better blood sugar control after eating because of the insulin-glucagon balance, and reduced feelings of hunger leading to lower calorie intake, which drives the weight loss.
That's a perfect summary. You get better post-meal blood sugar levels, and you tend to eat less because your appetite is reduced and you feel full more quickly and for longer. That combination leads to weight loss over time.
And you mentioned other potential benefits beyond just glucose and weight.
Yes, research is increasingly showing additional positive effects. There's strong evidence now for cardiovascular benefits. The large outcome trials we discussed earlier showed reductions in heart attacks, strokes, and cardiovascular death in high-risk individuals. The exact mechanisms are still being fully worked out, but might involve effects on blood pressure, cholesterol, inflammation, and maybe even direct effects on the heart and blood vessels.
Fascinating. Any others?
There's also emerging data suggesting potential benefits for kidney health, possibly slowing the progression of diabetic kidney disease. And research is ongoing into potential anti-inflammatory effects and even neuroprotective effects, though the latter is still quite early stage, mostly in animal models for conditions like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's.
Wow, quite a range. We touched on this before, but just to reiterate, why do most of them have to be injected?
It really comes down to their chemical structure. As peptides chains of amino acids, they are essentially proteins, if you were to swallow them in a standard pill.
Your stomach would just digest them.
Exactly. The enzymes in our digestive system, designed to break down the proteins we eat, would break down the drug before it could be absorbed into the bloodstream and have its effect. That's why the vast majority are delivered via subcutaneous injection, a small needle under the skin, usually in the abdomen, thigh, or upper arm, either daily or, more commonly now, weekly.
And the exception is oral semaglutide, Rybelsus.
Right. That uses that special formulation with an absorption enhancer called SNAC to protect the peptide and help a small fraction of it get absorbed through the stomach lining.
And how are these complex molecules actually made? It doesn't sound simple.
No, it's quite sophisticated pharmaceutical manufacturing. The techniques can vary depending on the specific drug's size and complexity. Smaller peptide molecules, like the original exenatide, can sometimes be made through complex chemical synthesis, basically building the amino acid chains step by step.
Okay.
But for the larger analogs, or the really complex ones like dulaglutide, Trulicity, which is fused to an antibody fragment, they are typically produced using recombinant DNA technology.
Like how insulin is made.
The very similar principle, yes. You insert the gene for the desired protein into host cells, often bacteria or yeast or mammalian cells, turn them into little factories, grow them up in large bioreactors, and then purify the protein product.
And a lot of the cleverness is in making them last longer in the body, right? The modifications.
Yeah, absolutely. A huge amount of molecular engineering goes into optimizing these molecules for stability and duration of action. We talked about attaching that fatty acid tail to liraglutide and semaglutide that helps them bind to albumin in the blood, which acts like a reservoir and protects them from rapid breakdown by the DPP-4 enzyme. Other strategies involve making small substitutions in the amino acid sequence to make the peptide itself inherently more resistant to DPP-4, or fusing it to larger molecules like antibodies, as in dulaglutide. All these tricks extend the half-life from minutes for natural GLP-1 to days for the once-weekly drugs.
And the delivery devices themselves, the pens, they seem pretty user-friendly these days.
Yes, a lot of effort goes into designing the injector pens to be as simple and painless as possible for patients to use at home. Pre-filled pens, simple dial-up dosing, very fine needles, it all helps with adherence.
And that brings us back one last time to oral semaglutide. That SNAC technology sounds like a really big deal for the future.
It really is potentially transformative. That absorption enhancer, sodium caprolate, SNAC, works by temporarily altering the environment in the stomach and increasing the permeability of the cells lining the stomach, allowing a small amount, maybe around 1% of the semaglutide peptide, to sneak across into the bloodstream.
Only 1%. That sounds tiny.
It is low bioavailability, yes, but the dose of semaglutide in the Rybelsus tablet, typically 7 milligram or 14 milligrams daily, is high enough that even that small percentage getting absorbed is sufficient to reach therapeutic levels in the blood and have the desired clinical effect.
So you just put a lot more in the pill to start with.
Essentially, yes. And this successful development is really exciting because it demonstrates proof of concept. It opens up the possibility for developing oral formulations of other peptide drugs in the future, not just for diabetes or obesity, but maybe for other conditions too. Overcoming the challenge of oral peptide delivery would be a massive game changer for patient convenience and acceptance.
Definitely something to watch. Okay, so we understand the mechanism now. Let's dig into the clinical trial evidence. How effective are these drugs really when put to the test? starting with type 2 diabetes?
Well, right from the beginning with exenatide and liraglutide, the clinical trials showed very clearly that GLP-1 agonists are highly effective at lowering blood glucose levels in people with type 2 diabetes.
How do they stack up against other diabetes meds?
In numerous head-to-head trials, they've consistently shown greater reductions in HbA1c, again, that key measure of long-term blood sugar control compared to placebo, and often compared to commonly used oral diabetes medications like metformin or sulfonylureas, or even DPP-4 inhibitors.
Better than those.
Often, yes, in terms of the magnitude of HbA1c reduction. For example, early studies with exenatide typically showed reductions around 0.8 to 1% point compared to placebo. Liraglutide pushed that a bit further, maybe 1.1 to 1.5%.
And the newer ones. Semaglutide, tirzepatide.
Even more potent, semaglutide Ozempic regularly demonstrates HbA1c reductions in the range of 1.5 to 1.8%, sometimes even exceeding 2% in certain populations or trials. Tirzepatide, Mounjaro, has shown even greater reductions, averaging around 2.3% in some key trials. In many situations, especially for patients with moderately controlled diabetes, their glucose-lowering power is comparable to, or in some cases even superior to, starting basal insulin.
Wow. So very powerful for blood sugar. And on top of that, there's the weight loss benefit, even in the diabetes patients, right?
Absolutely. That's a major secondary benefit. Unlike some other diabetes medications, notably insulin and sulfonylureas, which can cause weight gain, most GLP-1 receptor agonists lead to significant weight loss in patients with type 2 diabetes, typically in the range of 5 to 10% of their starting body weight.
Which is great because weight is often a big factor in type 2 diabetes itself.
Exactly. Losing weight can improve insulin sensitivity and overall metabolic health. We also often see improvements in other cardiovascular risk factors in these patients when they take GLP-1s, like modest reductions in blood pressure and improvements in cholesterol levels.
And this brings us to maybe the most impactful finding for diabetes: the cardiovascular outcomes. These aren't just about managing symptoms. Some actually protect the heart.
This is a critical point, yes. Starting in the mid to late 2010s, regulatory agencies required large, long-term cardiovascular outcome trials, or CVOTs, for new diabetes drugs to prove they were safe for the heart.
Okay.
What emerged from these trials for several GLP-1 agonists was not just safety, but actual cardiovascular protection. Trials like LEADER for liraglutide, Victoza, SUSTAIN-6, and PIONEER-6 for semaglutide, Ozempic Rybelsus, and REWIND for dulaglutide, Trulicity.
What do they show?
They demonstrated that these drugs significantly reduce the risk of major adverse cardiovascular events, typically defined as a composite of cardiovascular death, non-fatal heart attack, and non-fatal stroke in patients with type 2 diabetes who already had established cardiovascular disease or were at high risk. The risk reductions were generally in the range of 12% to 26%, depending on the specific drug and trial.
That's a big deal for a diabetes drug.
A massive deal. As a result of this compelling evidence, both Ozempic, semaglutide, and Victoza, liraglutide, received specific FDA label indications for reducing cardiovascular risk in diabetic patients with known heart disease. This was a real landmark moment, a class of diabetes drugs proven not just to lower blood sugar, but to actually improve cardiovascular survival and reduce events.
Incredible. And that benefit seems to extend even to people without diabetes, based on that recent SELECT trial you mentioned earlier. This seems huge, suggesting a broader role maybe in preventative medicine.
Yes, the SELECT trial, with results released in 2023, was really pivotal in this regard. It took over 17,000 adults who were overweight or obese, BMI 27 or higher, but did not have diabetes. However, they all had pre-existing cardiovascular disease, a history of heart attack, stroke, or peripheral artery disease.
So a high-risk group, just without the diabetes label.
Exactly. They were randomized to receive either semaglutide 2.4 milligram weekly, the Wegovy dose, or a placebo, in addition to standard care for the cardiovascular condition.
Yeah, and the results.
Over an average follow-up of about 3.3 years, the group receiving semaglutide had a statistically significant 20% lower risk of experiencing a major adverse cardiovascular event, heart attack, stroke, or cardiovascular death compared to the placebo group.
20% reduction just from the drug in non-diabetics. Wow.
It's a very strong finding. And importantly, the participants in the semaglutide group also experienced, as expected, significant weight loss, around 9 to 10% of their body weight on average during the trial.
So does the heart benefit come from the weight loss, or is there something else going on?
That's the million-dollar question, and the trial suggests it's likely a combination. The weight loss certainly contributes, as do improvements in blood pressure and inflammation markers seen with semaglutide. But many experts believe there may also be direct beneficial effects of GLP-1 activation on the cardiovascular system itself, independent of weight loss. Regardless of the exact mechanism split, the results clearly highlight the potential of these therapies to prevent serious cardiovascular events in a much broader population of high-risk individuals defined by obesity and prior CVD, not just those with diabetes.
That could have massive implications for public health strategy.
Okay, let's shift focus now specifically to obesity and weight loss in people who may or may not have diabetes. The results here seem even more dramatic in some ways.
They are indeed very striking. The efficacy we've seen with the newer generation GLP-1 receptor agonists in treating obesity, particularly in non-diabetic individuals, has really surpassed expectations in previous pharmacotherapies.
Let's start with liraglutide again, Saxenda. That was the first one approved for obesity. How did it do? Right. Initial trials with liraglutide at the higher 3.0 milligram dose approved for obesity, Saxenda, showed an average weight loss of around 8% of body weight over 56 weeks, compared to about 2.5% with placebo. This was considered quite good at the time, enough to produce meaningful improvements in health markers.
Okay, 8%. Significant. But then came the real leap you mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
with semaglutide 2.4 milligram Wegovy.
Exactly. The results from the pivotal STEP program trials, published around 2021, were what really electrified the field. Across several large trials in people with obesity, with or without diabetes, semaglutide 2.4 milligram weekly resulted in an average body weight reduction of around 15% over 68 weeks.
15% average, that's nearly double Saxenda.
Precisely. And again, the placebo groups in these trials typically lost only about 2 to 3%. What was even more impressive was the proportion of people achieving substantial weight loss. Roughly 1/3 or more of the participants taking Wegovy lost over 20% of their body weight.
A third lost over 20%. That's phenomenal for a drug.
It really is. Those are results that, as we said, start to blur the lines with the outcomes seen after some types of bariatric surgery like gastric banding or even sleeve gastrectomy in some cases.
Truly transformative numbers. And then, hot on its heels, tirzepatide came along with the SURMOUNT trials and seems to have raised the bar even higher.
That's what the data indicates, yes. Tirzepatide's dedicated obesity trials under the SURMOUNT program have reported even greater average weight loss. On the highest dose studied and approved for obesity, 15 milligrams weekly, the average weight loss was consistently reported as being up to 20 to 22% over about 72 weeks of treatment.
20 to 22% average.
Yes. And in the key SURMOUNT-1 trial, for instance, nearly half, almost 50% of the participants randomized to the 15 milligram dose of tirzepatide achieved at least 20% weight loss. And a substantial portion, around a third, lost 25% or more of their body weight.
That's just incredible. It really feels like a completely new era in obesity pharmacotherapy. We've gone from drugs maybe giving 5% loss to now potentially 20-25% for many people.
It absolutely is a new era. These outcomes significantly surpass what was achievable with older anti-obesity medications. And importantly, alongside this profound weight loss, patients in these trials consistently experience significant improvements in cardiometabolic risk factors, better blood pressure, improved lipid profiles, reductions in liver fat, better physical function, and reported improvements in quality of life.
And these impressive benefits, are they generally consistent across different global populations and demographics?
Broadly speaking, yes. The major clinical trial programs for drugs like semaglutide and tirzepatide have been conducted internationally, including sites across North America, Europe, Latin America, Asia, and other regions. And the efficacy in terms of percentage weight loss has generally been quite consistent across these diverse populations.
What about specific groups, like Asian populations who sometimes have different BMI considerations?
That's a good question. There have been specific trials conducted, for example, in Japan to support regulatory approvals there. These trials have shown similar percentage weight loss benefits, even though the average starting BMIs in those populations might be slightly lower than in Western cohorts. The relative effect seems consistent.
And within the U.S., do we see similar effects across different ethnic groups?
The large U.S. trials have included diverse ethnic groups, and generally the efficacy appears consistent. However, as we'll likely discuss later, there can be significant disparities in access and uptake of these medications in real-world settings across different racial and socioeconomic groups. But the biological potential seems similar.
Okay. And the research isn't stopping there. They're looking at other patient groups too.
Definitely not stopping.
Yeah.
Researchers are actively exploring the potential of GLP-1 RAs in several new areas. There's been strong trial data now for adolescents with obesity, showing significant weight loss with both liraglutide and semaglutide, leading to approvals in that age group.
That could be really important.
Very important. There's also a lot of interest in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or AFLD, which is strongly linked to obesity and diabetes. Studies are showing these drugs can reduce liver fat and inflammation. And as I mentioned briefly before, there's exploratory research, mostly preclinical right now, looking at potential neuroprotective effects for conditions like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, based on GLP-1 receptors found in the brain and some anti-inflammatory mechanisms.
Wow. Still early days for those neurological applications, I assume.
Oh yes, very much experimental for neurodegenerative diseases. But it highlights the broad physiological roles of the GLP-1 system and the potential reach of these therapies beyond just glucose and weight.
Okay, so the effectiveness data is clearly very impressive, bordering on revolutionary for obesity. But no drug is without potential downsides. Well, let's talk about the side effects and the overall safety profile. What do people need to be aware of?
That's absolutely crucial to discuss. Like all effective medications, GLP-1 receptor agonists do come with a side effect profile. By far, the most common side effects are gastrointestinal in nature.
Nausea, vomiting.
Exactly. Nausea is very common, especially when starting the medication or increasing the dose. Vomiting, diarrhea, constipation, and sometimes abdominal pain or discomfort are also frequently reported.
Are these usually severe? Do they go away?
For most people, these GI side effects are rated as mild to moderate in intensity. They often tend to be worst during the initial weeks of treatment or after a dose escalation, and they usually improve or resolve over time as the body adapts. However, for some individuals, they can be persistent or bothersome enough to lead them to discontinue the medication. That slow gastric emptying we talked about, which helps with fullness, can be a double-edged sword. It helps satiety, but can also contribute to feelings of prolonged fullness, bloating, or indigestion, sometimes called dyspepsia.
And there were some concerning reports in media recently about very severe stomach issues, like gastroparesis.
Yes, there have been anecdotal reports and some case studies emerging, particularly in 2023, describing rare instances of severe gastroparesis, essentially. Paralysis of the stomach leading to intractable nausea and vomiting in patients taking these drugs. Regulators are actively monitoring this, but it appears to be a rare event currently. Still, it highlights that the effects on gut motility can be profound in some individuals.
Okay. What about other common side effects besides the GI ones?
Some people report headache, fatigue, or dizziness, particularly early on. Injection site reactions like redness or itching at the spot where the drug is injected can occur, though they seemed more common with the earlier drugs like exenatide.
And the risk of low blood sugar? Hypoglycemia, you said was low.
Yes, when GLP-1 agonists are used alone as monotherapy or in combination with drugs that don't independently cause hypoglycemia, like metformin, the risk of low blood sugar is very low. That's because of their glucose-dependent mechanism. However, if they're used in combination with medications that can cause hypoglycemia, such as sulfonylureas or especially insulin,
Then the risk goes up.
then the risk of hypoglycemia definitely increases. So when adding a GLP-1 agonist to insulin or a sulfonylurea, it's often necessary to reduce the dose of the other medication proactively to prevent lows. Careful blood sugar monitoring is key in those situations.
Makes sense. Now, there have been some more specific safety concerns investigated over the years. What about pancreatitis? That was a worry early on.
It was. Around 2013-2014, there was considerable scrutiny following some early reports suggesting a possible link between incretin-based drugs, including GLP-1 RAs and another class called DPP-4 inhibitors, and an increased risk of pancreatitis, or inflammation of the pancreas, and even pancreatic cancer.
Scary stuff. What did the investigations find?
Extensive reviews of clinical trial data and large observational studies were conducted by regulatory agencies like the FDA and EMA. Their conclusions generally were that the data did not confirm a causal link or a significantly higher rate of pancreatitis or pancreatic cancer associated with these drugs compared to what you'd expect in a similar population of patients with diabetes who already have a higher baseline risk.
So the link wasn't proven.
Not definitively proven as causal in the large analyses. However, pancreatitis has been reported in patients taking GLP-1 RAs both in trials and post-marketing. So the prescribing information typically advises caution in patients with a prior history of pancreatitis and recommends discontinuing the drug if pancreatitis is suspected. The risk seems low, but it's something clinicians remain aware of, especially with long-term use.
Okay. Another one that always comes up is thyroid tumors. What's the story there?
Right. This stems from findings in preclinical studies, specifically in rodents. Studies with liraglutide, semaglutide, and some other GLP-1 RAs showed that long-term, high-dose exposure led to an increase in thyroid C-cell tumors, including a rare type called medullary thyroid carcinoma, MTC, in rats and mice.
Tumors in rats. Does that translate to humans?
That's the key question. Rodents have many more GLP-1 receptors on their thyroid C cells than humans do, making them potentially more susceptible to this effect from chronic stimulation. Importantly, large clinical trials and long-term observational studies in humans have not shown an increased risk of MTC or other thyroid cancers in patients using these drugs. Human ATC is very rare overall.
But there's still a warning, right?
Yes. Because the theoretical risk based on animal data couldn't be completely ruled out, especially for that rare MTC, the FDA requires a boxed warning, their strongest type on most GLP-1 RAs. This warning advises against using the drug in patients with a personal or family history of MTC, or in those with a rare genetic condition called multiple endocrine neoplasia syndrome type 2, MNN2, which predisposes them to MTC.
So avoid in those specific high-risk individuals.
Exactly. Clinicians generally avoid prescribing these drugs in that small subset of patients. But for the general population without that specific risk, thyroid cancer has not emerged as a significant safety concern based on the extensive human data accumulated so far.
Good to know. What about gallbladder issues? I've heard that mentioned too.
Yes, there appears to be a slightly increased risk of gallbladder-related problems like gallstones, cholelithiasis, or gallbladder inflammation, cholecystitis, observed in some clinical trials, particularly those involving significant weight loss.
Is it the drug itself or the weight loss?
It's thought to be primarily an indirect effect related to the rapid weight loss itself, rather than a direct toxic effect of the drug on the gallbladder. Rapid weight loss through any means, diet, surgery, medication, is known to increase the risk of gallstone formation. So it's likely a consequence of the drug's effectiveness in promoting weight loss.
Okay. And effects on the eyes. Diabetic retinopathy.
This was an interesting finding that came out of the SUSTAIN-6 cardiovascular trial for semaglutide. In that specific trial, there was a higher rate of complications related to diabetic retinopathy damage to the blood vessels in the retina observed in the semaglutide group compared to placebo.
That sounds concerning. Why would that happen?
The leading hypothesis is that this wasn't a direct toxic effect, but rather a consequence of the very rapid improvement in blood sugar control seen with semaglutide in patients who had pre-existing, often poorly controlled, diabetic eye disease. It's known that sometimes a very quick drop in high blood sugar can temporarily worsen retinopathy in the short term.
So like the eye adjusting too quickly.
Something like that. Subsequent analyses and other trials haven't consistently shown this effect to the same degree. However, current guidelines generally advise caution when initiating these potent drugs in patients who already have significant diabetic retinopathy and very high blood sugar levels. Close ophthalmologic follow-up is recommended for those individuals.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, a newer topic of debate seems to be around muscle loss and body composition changes. What's the concern there?
Right, this has become a hot topic recently. When people lose weight, especially rapidly, they typically lose a combination of fat mass and lean body mass, which includes muscle. The concern with very effective weight loss drugs, like the newer GLP-1 agonists, is whether they might lead to a disproportionate loss of muscle mass compared to fat mass.
Why is losing muscle a problem?
Losing too much muscle can be detrimental for several reasons. It can lower your metabolic rate, making it harder to keep weight off long term. It can affect strength, physical function, and potentially increase the risk of frailty, especially in older adults.
So what do the studies show? Is it excessive muscle loss?
Studies looking at body composition changes with GLP-1 RAs are ongoing, and the results are a bit mixed depending on how it's measured. Some studies suggest that the proportion of weight lost as lean mass, maybe around 20–40%, is roughly similar to what's seen with significant weight loss from diet or bariatric surgery. So maybe not disproportionately high, but still a significant absolute amount of muscle can be lost when someone loses, say, 15–20% of their total body weight.
So the loss happens, but maybe it's expected with that much weight loss.
That seems to be the current thinking for many experts. However, there's still debate and a need for more long-term data. The key takeaway is that preserving muscle mass during weight loss is important.
What can people do about it?
The strong recommendation from experts is to combine these medications with lifestyle measures, particularly regular resistance exercise, like weightlifting or body weight exercises, to stimulate muscle maintenance and growth, and ensuring adequate dietary protein intake. Some recent articles, like one on AOL.com citing studies, emphasize this combination approach. So it's not just about the drug. Exercise and nutrition are crucial partners to ensure the quality of the weight loss.
Quality, not just quantity. Good point. Finally, what about psychological effects? There was some noise about a potential link to depression or suicidal thoughts.
Yes, in 2023, European regulatory agencies initiated a review after receiving a small number of post-marketing case reports suggesting a possible link between GLP-1 agonists and thoughts of self-harm or suicide.
What did that review conclude?
After examining the available evidence, including clinical trial data and real-world reports, the European Medicines Agency, EMA, concluded that there was no clear causal association established between these drugs and an increased risk of suicidal thoughts or actions. They noted that depression and suicidal ideation can unfortunately occur in the context of obesity and its management itself, and the data didn't support the drugs being the primary driver.
So, no causal link found.
Not based on the evidence reviewed so far. However, as a precaution, prescribing information in some regions now advises clinicians to monitor patients for any changes in mood or the emergence of suicidal thoughts. It's something clinicians remain attentive to, recognizing the underlying mental health challenges that can sometimes accompany obesity.
Okay, so putting it all together, the side effects are mainly GI, usually manageable. There are specific warnings for rare conditions like MTC history or maybe caution with retinopathy. And the muscle loss aspect highlights the need for exercise and protein. Overall, how do experts view the safety profile?
Generally, considering the significant benefits these drugs offer for controlling type 2 diabetes and promoting substantial weight loss, and the serious health risks associated with uncontrolled diabetes and obesity, the overall safety profile of GLP-1 receptor agonists is considered acceptable and favorable for most appropriate patients.
Millions of people have used them now.
Exactly. We now have millions of patient years of exposure, especially to the earlier agents. And so far, no unexpected, crippling long-term safety signals have emerged across the class. The side effects are definitely real, and they lead some people to stop treatment. But for many others, the benefits for their metabolic health, cardiovascular risk, and quality of life appear to outweigh the manageable downsides, provided they are used appropriately under medical supervision.
That seems like a reasonable balance.
Yeah.
Now, these drugs haven't just stayed in the clinic or medical journals. They've exploded into public consciousness, pop culture, social media, in a way few prescription drugs ever do, especially Ozempic and Wegovy.
Yeah.
Why do you think that happened?
A huge part of it, undoubtedly, is the sheer effectiveness for weight loss, combined with high-profile attention. When reports started surfacing, maybe around 2022, 2023, about celebrities potentially using these drugs for weight management and showing noticeable results.
Like Elon Musk tweeting about Wegovy.
Exactly. That kind of thing, plus the visual nature of weight loss, made it a very compelling story for traditional media, and especially for social media. You saw the rise of the hashtag Ozempic hashtag on platforms like TikTok, accumulating hundreds of millions, maybe even billions of views by now.
Billions. Wow. What were people sharing?
All sorts of things. Personal weight loss testimonials, before and after pictures, discussions about side effects, tips, controversies. There was even the so-called Ozempic challenge and discussions about Ozempic face, the facial changes that can happen with rapid weight loss. It just went viral in a way that's very unusual for a diabetes medication.
And this intense public fascination and demand had real-world consequences, right? Like shortages.
Absolutely. The skyrocketing demand, particularly for Wegovy, semaglutide for obesity, and also for Ozempic being used off-label for weight loss before Wegovy was widely available or covered.
People using the diabetes drug for weight loss.
Right. This surge in demand completely overwhelmed the supply chains, leading to widespread global shortages of both Ozempic and Wegovy throughout much of 2022 and 2023. This had a serious negative impact, as many people with type 2 diabetes who relied on Ozempic for glucose control suddenly couldn't get their prescriptions filled.
That must have caused a lot of anxiety and disruption. Did regulators step in?
Yes, regulatory bodies and health authorities in several countries took action. For instance, Australia temporarily restricted new Ozempic prescriptions mainly to patients with diabetes to protect the supply. Warnings were issued in Europe, like in France and the UK, reminding doctors about appropriate prescribing, discouraging off-label promotion, and urging caution to ensure access for diabetic patients.
What did the manufacturers say? Novo Nordisk.
Novo Nordisk publicly stated they didn't support or promote off-label use of Ozempic for weight loss and emphasized the importance of reserving it for its approved indication. They also announced massive investments like $1.6 billion back in 2022 and billions more since, specifically aimed at expanding their manufacturing capacity to try and meet the unprecedented demand for semaglutide.
So the public reception has been this real mix then. Huge enthusiasm for many who see life-changing results, but also caution, criticism.
Definitely a mixed bag. You have immense enthusiasm from patients and doctors witnessing transformative weight loss and health improvements, but you also hear significant caution and sometimes criticism, concerns about it being a quick fix, debates about medication versus traditional diet and exercise, moralizing about taking the easy way out, and worries about the drugs being used primarily for cosmetic reasons by people who aren't significantly overweight. There's also the whole Ozempic face discussion feeding into vanity concerns.
How does that contrast with how obesity medicine specialists view these drugs?
Most obesity medicine specialists tend to view obesity as a complex, chronic disease, influenced by genetics, biology, environment, not just willpower. From that perspective, having powerful new medical tools like GLP-1 agonists to treat this disease is seen as a major breakthrough, analogous to using medications to treat high blood pressure or high cholesterol. They see it as treating the underlying pathophysiology, not just a lifestyle issue.
And pharmaceutical marketing has played a role too, presumably.
Oh, certainly. Especially in the US, you see extensive direct-to-consumer advertising for drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy. They think of the catchy Ozempic jingle. That definitely increases public awareness and patients asking their doctors about it. There's also significant marketing targeted at physicians, sponsoring medical education, funding patient advocacy groups, lobbying efforts, etc.
And the celebrity factor just amplifies everything.
It does. Whether celebrities openly admit using the drugs, like Musk did, or face speculation and denials, it keeps the drugs in the headlines and fuels public curiosity.
So it feels like GLP-1 agonists achieve this incredibly unusual level of name recognition for a prescription drug, especially one initially for diabetes.
Absolutely. And this has led to a real push from medical professionals and health organizations for better patient education, emphasizing that these are serious medications for treating specific health conditions, diabetes, obesity with related health problems, not casual weight loss aids. Stressing the importance of using them under medical supervision due to the side effects and necessary monitoring, and focusing on health improvement over purely cosmetic goals.
Do you think this intense spotlight might have any positive effects, maybe reducing stigma?
That's a potential silver lining some experts point to. The widespread conversation, despite some of the hype and controversy, has arguably increased public discussion about obesity as a treatable medical condition. It might be helping to destigmatize the use of medication as a legitimate tool for weight management alongside diet and exercise, shifting the narrative away from just personal failure towards recognizing the biological complexities. That could be a positive outcome in the long run.
An interesting perspective. Let's track back to the official side of things. Can you give us a quick timeline of some of the key regulatory approvals just to see the progression?
Sure. Hitting the major milestones, mostly in the U.S. 2005, exenatide Byetta approved for type 2 diabetes, the first GLP-1 RA.
Okay, the lizard drug.
Exactly. 2010, liraglutide Victoza approved for type 2 diabetes, once daily option. 2012, exenatide extended release by Durion approved, the first once weekly.
More convenience.
Right. 2014, this was a big year. Dulaglutide Trulicity approved for type 2 diabetes, another weekly. And liraglutide 3.0 milligram Saxenda approved specifically for obesity.
The first obesity approval for this class.
A landmark. 2016, lixisenatide Adlixin approved for diabetes. 2017, semaglutide 0.5 mg 1.0 milligram Ozempic approved for type 2 diabetes, a major potency increase.
The game changer arrives.
Arguably. 2019, oral semaglutide Rybelsus approved for type 2 diabetes, the first pill form.
Another big innovation.
Definitely. 2021, semaglutide 2.4 milligram Wegovy approved for obesity. This really fueled the explosion in interest due to the 15% weight loss results.
The one everyone talks about for weight loss.
Pretty much. 2022. Tirzepatide, Mounjaro, approved for type 2 diabetes. The first dual GLP-1 GIP agonist.
The next generation.
That's the view. Late 2023. Tirzepatide gets its obesity approval in the U.S. under the name Zepbound. Also, Wegovy gets approved for obesity in Japan around this time, 2024. Both Wegovy and tirzepatide for obesity gain approval in China.
And looking ahead.
We're anticipating potential EMA approval for tirzepatide for obesity, maybe in 2025. And of course, newer combination drugs are moving through clinical trials, so the pipeline is still very active.
So regulators seem generally supportive, but keeping a close eye on things?
That sums it up well. They recognize the significant unmet need and the strong efficacy data, especially for obesity. But they remain vigilant regarding safety monitoring, like that EMA review in 2023, which ultimately reaffirmed a positive benefit-risk balance. They're also concerned about appropriate use. That whole issue of indication creep, like Ozempic being widely used off-label for weight loss before Wegovy was readily available, definitely caused some regulatory discomfort. There's now a stronger focus on ensuring these drugs are prescribed according to their approved indications and criteria, like specific BMI thresholds plus comorbidities for the obesity approvals.
Right, using them for the intended patients. Now, this brings us squarely to a huge issue: health policy and economics. These drugs are incredibly effective, but they also come with a very hefty price tag. What are the implications for access and healthcare budgets?
This is arguably the biggest challenge surrounding these medications right now. The list prices in the U.S. are often around $1,000 to $1,300 per month per patient. Given the sheer number of people potentially eligible based on diabetes and obesity rates, the potential budget impact for healthcare systems, governments, insurers, employers is enormous.
Let's talk about the U.S. specifically. What's the situation with insurance coverage? Hasn't Medicare been a barrier for obesity treatment?
Historically, yes. A statute passed back in 2003 specifically excluded coverage of drugs used for weight loss from Medicare Part D. While Medicare covered these drugs for diabetes, it wouldn't cover the same drug if prescribed solely for obesity.
That seems odd.
It created a significant barrier. And because many private insurance plans tend to follow Medicare's lead on coverage policies, this often resulted in limited or no coverage for anti-obesity medications in the private sector as well, or requiring very strict criteria like a high BMI, often 30 or more, plus related health conditions, and needing prior authorization.
But is that changing? There seems to be a lot of pressure now.
There is immense pressure. Advocacy groups, medical societies, and patients have been pushing for years. We started seeing some large employers voluntarily choosing to add coverage for Wegovy and similar drugs to their health plans by 2023. And then a potentially major shift happened in late 2024.
What is that?
The Biden administration, through the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, issued guidance suggesting that Medicare Part D plans could cover these anti-obesity medications like Wegovy or Zepbound, specifically when used to treat obesity in patients who also have established cardiovascular disease.
Linking it to these select trial results. Treating obesity to reduce heart risk.
Exactly. It was a reinterpretation suggesting that if the drug is used to manage obesity and reduce the risk of another covered condition, like heart attack or stroke, then it could potentially be covered. It's not a full reversal of the old statute, but a significant potential workaround.
What impact could that have?
If widely adopted by Part D plans, it could open up access to an estimated 7 million or more Medicare beneficiaries, plus potentially influencing Medicaid coverage as well. It's a huge potential expansion.
But the cost? What's the political reaction?
It's complex. There's excitement about improving health, but major concerns about the cost impact. Estimates suggest it could add tens of billions to Medicare spending over a decade and significant costs for Medicaid, too. There's likely to be pushback and debate over the budget implications. The counterargument, of course, is about potential long-term savings from preventing costly complications of obesity like heart attacks, strokes, diabetes progression, knee replacements, etc.
Is there legislation trying to address this more directly?
Yes. For years, there's been bipartisan support for bills like the Treat and Reduce Obesity Act, TROA, or the newer Deal with Obesity Act, which would explicitly remove that old Medicare exclusion and allow coverage for FDA-approved anti-obesity medications and potentially other services like intensive behavioral therapy. These bills haven't passed yet, but the pressure continues to build.
So the U.S. situation is evolving but still complex. What about internationally? How do other countries handle coverage?
It varies tremendously. Access is definitely not uniform globally. In the UK, for example, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, NAC, which advises the NHS, has endorsed Wegovy, but with quite specific restrictions.
What kind of restrictions?
Generally, it's recommended only for patients with a very high BMI plus at least one weight-related comorbidity. It has to be prescribed within a specialist weight management service, and crucially, the initial recommendation was for a maximum treatment duration of only 2 years.
Only 2 years. Why?
That reflects their cost-effectiveness analysis and perhaps a hope or aim to see if patients can maintain weight loss after stopping the drug, though we know rebound is common. It highlights the cost pressures even in publicly funded systems. Other European countries are also grappling with reimbursement decisions. Denmark and Norway have limited coverage, often requiring significant patient copays. Coverage for the diabetes indication is generally better across Europe than for the obesity indication.
And in lower-income countries?
Access is extremely limited in most emerging economies and low-income countries, primarily due to the high cost. This raises major global health equity concerns as obesity rates are rising worldwide.
Are there strategies to address that? Generics?
These are complex biologic drugs, so traditional generic competition is trickier than for small molecule pills. It requires biosimilar development, which is expensive. There's discussion about potential tiered pricing strategies from manufacturers or maybe local manufacturing partnerships like we're seeing emerge in places like India or China, potentially developing their own domestic GLP-1 agents like mazdutide or local liraglutide versions, which could eventually drive down prices through competition. But widespread affordable access globally is still a major hurdle.
Affordability and cost-effectiveness seem to be the crux of the issue everywhere.
They really are. Independent bodies that evaluate cost-effectiveness, like the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, ICR, in the U.S., have analyzed these drugs. Their 2022 analysis, for example, concluded that Wegovy was likely not cost-effective at its launch price for broad use in obesity, unless the price was substantially reduced, maybe by 40–50%, or if it was targeted only to the very highest-risk patient subgroups.
So the value's there, but the price is too high for the system to bear for everyone eligible.
That's the fundamental economic challenge. Treating potentially tens of millions of adults with obesity with a drug costing over $10,000 a year per person puts immense strain on healthcare budgets. Insurers are actively exploring ways to manage these costs, strict prior authorization criteria, step therapy, requiring trying cheaper options first, negotiating rebates with manufacturers, sometimes placing lifetime caps on coverage.
This brings us back to health equity. If access is determined by cost and insurance hurdles, who gets left behind?
This is a critical concern. We know that obesity disproportionately impacts lower-income communities and certain minority populations in the U.S. and elsewhere. These are often the same groups who face more barriers to accessing healthcare in general, including specialists who might prescribe these drugs and who may have insurance plans with less generous coverage or higher copays.
Is there evidence this disparity is already happening?
Yes, some early real-world analyses in the U.S. have shown, for example, that Black and Hispanic patients are less likely to be prescribed GLP-1 agonists compared to white patients, even after adjusting for factors like insurance status and baseline health. Reasons are complex, could be less access to specialists, lower rates of insurance approval, affordability of copays, maybe implicit bias in prescribing.
So these powerful drugs could actually worsen health disparities if access isn't equitable.
That is the significant risk. If only the wealthy or those with the best insurance can readily access these highly effective treatments, it could absolutely widen the already existing gaps in obesity rates and related health outcomes.
Is there anything being done to counter that?
There's increasing advocacy focused specifically on health equity and access to obesity care. Some states are taking steps to expand Medicaid coverage for anti-obesity medications. Community health centers and programs are exploring ways to integrate these therapies into care for underserved populations. But it requires conscious effort and policy changes to ensure that the benefits of these breakthroughs reach those who stand to gain the most, including those with the highest burden of disease who often have higher starting BMIs where these drugs can have the greatest absolute effect.
A really crucial point. Okay, looking at the bigger picture now, what are the broader implications and future directions for this whole class of drugs? It feels like we're at a turning point.
I think new era is not an exaggeration. The advent of highly effective GLP-1 receptor agonists, and now the dual agonists like tirzepatide, really represents a fundamental shift in how we can approach metabolic diseases like type 2 diabetes and obesity by targeting some of the core underlying hormonal drivers.
What are the potential public health implications if these become widely accessible and used? Let's start with diabetes.
For type 2 diabetes, the implications are profound. We could potentially see far fewer patients progressing to needing insulin or developing debilitating complications like kidney failure, blindness, or amputations. There's even the prospect of achieving diabetes remission, especially in early-stage disease. Studies have shown that significant weight loss, maybe 10–15% or more, can lead to remission of type 2 diabetes in a substantial number of people. These drugs now make that level of weight loss achievable for many more individuals without surgery.
So potentially reversing diabetes for some.
That's the hope and emerging possibility, yes. For obesity, the impact could be equally massive. These drugs offer a powerful tool, an adjunct to lifestyle changes. They aren't a magic bullet diet, and exercise remain crucial, and currently the drug usually needs to be continued long-term to maintain the weight loss.
The rebound effect is real if you stop.
Very real for most people. But the degree of weight loss achievable now with pharmacotherapy represents a paradigm shift compared to older non-surgical options. If used appropriately, they have the potential to help millions reach a healthier weight category, significantly reducing their risk of developing a whole host of related conditions, not just diabetes, but hypertension, sleep apnea, osteoarthritis, fatty liver disease, certain cancers, and as we saw with select cardiovascular events.
Could we even think about using them preventatively, like in people with pre-diabetes or just over the obesity threshold to stop them from progressing?
That's exactly where the thinking is starting to go, especially supported by trials like SELECT. The idea of intervening earlier in high-risk individuals, say, someone with prediabetes and a BMI of 30 or 35, to prevent the progression to type 2 diabetes or to prevent that first heart attack, seems increasingly plausible and is an active area of research and discussion.
How do these drugs fit in with other approaches? Lifestyle changes, surgery.
They are best seen as working synergistically with other measures. Combining GLP-1 RAs with intensive lifestyle intervention programs, focused diet, exercise, behavioral support, likely yields the best results. There's also research looking at combining them with other drug classes, like SGLT2 inhibitors, which also have diabetes and heart benefits, or using them before or after bariatric surgery. And as we discussed, the importance of incorporating exercise, especially resistance training, alongside these drugs to optimize body composition is critical. It suggests a future of multimodal, personalized obesity treatment with GLP-1-based therapies, likely serving as a cornerstone for many.
Are there cautionary notes we need to keep in mind, especially about long-term use for chronic obesity?
Absolutely. While the medium-term data, up to 3 to 5 years, looks promising, we still lack truly long-term data, say 10 years or more, on continuous use for obesity. Questions remain about potential long-term adaptations in the body, nutritional impacts, effects on muscle and bone health over decades, and as mentioned, the significant weight regain that occurs if the medication is stopped.
Is obesity something that needs lifelong treatment like high blood pressure, or could these drugs reset things?
That's a key debate and an active area of research. The dominant view currently leans towards obesity being a chronic, relapsing condition that likely requires long-term management, potentially including lifelong medication for many, similar to hypertension or high cholesterol. However, some researchers are exploring whether a period of significant pharmacologically induced weight loss might, in some individuals, allow for a kind of metabolic reset, enabling better long-term maintenance off medication, perhaps with continued lifestyle support. We don't have definitive answers yet.
And the pharmaceutical industry isn't standing still, right? There's a gold rush for even better therapies.
Oh, absolutely. The success of semaglutide and tirzepatide has triggered massive investment in developing next-generation therapies. We're seeing a focus on dual and triple agonists. Tirzepatide, GLP-1 GIP, is the first major success. Others targeting GLP-1 and glucagon, like cotadutide, are in trials. And even triple agonists hitting GLP-1, GIP, and glucagon receptors are in phase 2 trials and showing potentially even greater weight loss.
Hitting 3 pathways at once.
Exactly. The idea is to leverage multiple hormonal signals for potentially synergistic effects on appetite, energy expenditure, and glucose control. Oral and alternative delivery. The success of Rybelsus has spurred intense efforts to develop more oral peptide formulations using different absorption enhancers or nanoparticle technologies. There's also research into oral small molecules, non-peptides, that could activate the GLP-1 pathway, though none are close to market yet. Other mechanisms. Looking beyond incretins, exploring drugs targeting other appetite or energy balance pathways, potentially for combination therapy. Far-off ideas. Things like gene therapy approaches to maybe increase the body's own GLP-1 production, or ways to modulate the gut microbiome to boost natural GLP-1 levels. These are much more futuristic. Personalized medicine, research trying to identify genetic markers or baseline hormone levels that might predict who will respond best to which drug, allowing for more tailored therapy in the future.
So the pace of innovation is likely to continue. What's the critical implication for society and how we integrate all this?
A key hope is that these breakthroughs will continue to reduce the stigma associated with obesity and seeking treatment. That we move towards recognizing obesity as a complex medical condition deserving of evidence-based care, including medication when appropriate, just like we treat high cholesterol to prevent heart disease. Encouraging earlier intervention rather than waiting for severe complications to develop.
But balanced with that challenge of ensuring equitable access.
Absolutely. The challenge remains huge. How do we ensure that these powerful and potentially life-changing treatments are accessible and affordable to all the patients who could benefit, particularly those in underserved communities who often carry the highest burden of disease? Preventing these drugs from becoming solely accessible to the wealthy and well-insured is paramount to avoid widening health inequities. That's why the ongoing policy debates around coverage and costs are so critical.
And the macroeconomic impact.
It's massive. The market for obesity drugs alone is projected to potentially exceed $100 billion annually within the next decade. This huge market potential is what's driving the intense R&D investment, which is good for innovation. But it also raises fundamental questions about the sustainability of healthcare systems if a large percentage of the population requires these expensive medications long term. Finding a balance between incentivizing innovation and ensuring affordable, sustainable access is the tightrope policymakers and society need to walk.
It's an incredible story.
It really is. The journey of GLP-1 receptor agonists, from the initial discovery of a gut hormone to lizard venom insights, to becoming a major force in modern medicine for diabetes and now obesity, is a remarkable testament to the power of translating basic science discoveries into impactful therapies. Their use needs to be guided by evidence, focused on patient safety and well-being, and critically pursued in a way that promotes health equity. It's been a truly fascinating journey to trace, hasn't it? From those initial basic science discoveries about gut hormones, right through to the global phenomenon we see today.
It really has. A wild ride from lab benches to lizard venom to, social media fame and billionaire endorsements.
You couldn't make it up, really, including the complexities like the off-label use issues and the shortages.
Exactly. And I think for you, our listener, the key takeaway after exploring all this is that while the science is amazing and the potential is transformative, it's definitely not a simple miracle cure.
That's right. They are powerful tools, but not perfect. No medication is one size fits all.
So keep asking questions, maintain a balance of hope and healthy skepticism, and crucially, always, always talk to your doctor or a qualified healthcare professional about what's right for your individual health situation. Don't just rely on TikTok or celebrity news.
Excellent advice. Medical decisions need medical guidance, and we really want to thank you for joining us for this deep dive today. We covered a lot of ground.
We really did. If you found this discussion helpful or interesting, we'd love it if you'd subscribe to the channel, maybe leave a rating or review, and please share it with others, especially maybe those sharing questionable health info online.
Help spread good information. Until next time, stay healthy, stay curious,
and stay skeptical. Bye for now.
Goodbye, everyone.
And here's a final thought to leave you with. As these incredibly powerful weight loss and metabolic medications become potentially much more widespread, how do you think they will ultimately reshape not just individual health, but our societal understanding of weight, health, personal responsibility?